So, Selin, are you ready?
Yes.
Okay. So, I am Jennifer Guenther, and this is a presentation on mobilization of climate change and the impact on communities, essentially climate migration. I am an attorney practicing in California for 20 years, focused primarily on environmental law and CEQA, NEPA, and then I've spent the last 7 years working for an environmental company that does both environmental planning documents, but also sustainability, with a focus on different aspects of sustainability with regard to water, carbon, climate, you name it. Selin, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Selin Yildez Nielson, and my background is education. Basically, I'm a professor of education, and I look into policy studies. But I also have a nonprofit organization helping refugees. I look into forced migration and its effects, and for the last 10 years, I've been working on that. And I also have a background in architecture and renewable energy. I've been involved with that for many years. So in many aspects of a community, I'm familiar. So we thought it would be a good presentation to bring our skills and what we have to say about it.
Right, because we had started talking together based upon our different backgrounds. It brought together a really, I think, unique union of knowledge. And the idea that we're seeing more and more sustainable planning in communities, but what the sustainable planning isn't taking into consideration is the aspect of climate migration and the impact that has on communities. The fact that we're looking at the amount of energy that we're producing. We're looking at the amount of resources that are going to be necessary for our current populations. We're not thinking about the fact that people are moving, and they're moving not because they want to move, but because they're being forced to move for a lot of different reasons. They're moving as a result of immediate issues such as hurricanes, or earthquakes, or tsunamis, or weather-related events, and they're moving for other reasons that are a little bit longer term and a little bit harder to plan for, with regard to the loss of resources from climate change. So, migration, in fact, the numbers are actually pretty staggering. So right now, worldwide, we're looking at about 3.5 billion people who live in cities around the world. That's expected to increase by 2030. We're not talking 2050, 2070. We're talking by 2030 to 5 billion people. A lot of that is a result of people moving to the cities because, similar to what we saw, 100 years ago, there's a loss of resources within the country. Every time I think about this, I think about, Grapes of Wrath and the Dust Bowl, that was required reading when I was in high school. And the fact that there was a massive migration from the central and Midwest area of the United States to the coastlines, particularly in California, as a result of the Dust Bowl, of essentially a drought situation. That lasted for a couple of years and happened to hit right when we also had a major decline in other resources economically. But now we're looking at this not from sort of a one-time event. We're looking at this from a worldwide phenomenon of desertification occurring, rainfalls shifting, just the simple seasons are shifting.
I can also add to those numbers too.
Yeah.
Right now in the world, UNHCR says that there are about 70 million displaced people in the world for various reasons, and they expect this number to climb to 200 million people, which is like close to the population of the United States. To put it in perspective, like the 2/3 of the population of the United States will be displaced in the world. And we have to realize, where will these people go and how will they live?
Right. And we see this right now. We see this primarily in the Middle East, Middle Eastern countries. because that's what we're seeing in the media. But we're facing it right here in the United States as well, and in North America. So the next figure is the 680,000 climate migrants will move from Central America to the US by the year 2050. And this is just based upon modeling. We look at the border crisis that's happening now. The border crisis is happening not so much from political ramifications that we've seen in the past, but because of loss of resources. There's a lack of food. There's a changing and shifting of climate that is creating a situation where people no longer can essentially live where they're at. We're anticipating over the next 45 years that 1 in 12 Americans, mainly living in the southern US, because that's where it's anticipated that climate change will hit the hardest, will be moving again to the coast, California and the Northwest. Um, and that's a pretty staggering number when you think about the number. I mean, we have 200,000, excuse me, 200 million Americans. 1 in 12 is a staggering number of people that we anticipate to have a population shift. And on top of that, we look at things that we're currently facing with regard to water shortages in Southern California, the drought situations, the snowfall is becoming less and less as the climate heats up. These are all things that have to be taken into consideration along with this shift in population. So what we really wanted to focus on, because I know a lot of people are thinking, well, what does it have to mean? This is a social issue. It's not just a social issue. It's a infrastructure issue. It's an direct impact on how we plan our cities and our communities for the future, on how we create sustainable communities, because we can't just focus on the physical environmental impacts. We have to focus on sort of that overall viewpoint. So we wanted to look at, okay, why? Why are people shifting where they're located? One of the slides we're going to show you in a little bit has an interesting phenomenon, is that most of the places, at least within the US, we see this migration going to are actually other climate impact places. So we have a shift in population to California, which is facing its own climate challenges. We want to talk about what are some of the specific impacts that are being faced by the cities? What is being done? What sort of planning is happening now? This is a fairly new thing. We've talked about sustainability planning for at least 10 years, if not longer, on a municipality level, on a city level, on a state level, on a country level. And we're starting to see a business, if you will, for sustainable planning for cities and creating sustainable city documents. So what we're not seeing are dealing with these population increases. And so there are, sort of in the baby steps, cities that are starting to create this climate migration planning and actually creating a framework for that. So we wanted to look at what's being done currently, and then we wanted to look at what's the information that is out there that we no longer have, or that we don't have yet, that we need in order to truly do good planning. So and there's a good comment in the chat box. Land appropriation from indigenous folks used for crops for export has led to desertification, floods, poverty for prior residents on the land. We have political ramifications. How do we resolve this? How do we resolve this? I'm not sure that there's any simple solution to that. We have, these big hairy problems, the Hagues, that you try to poke at one place and all it does is shift where the impacts are to another place. And so it's this idea you have to look at things from an overall standpoint. So where we want to start is, what are some of the sources of climate migration? We have when we think about climate change, we have this very specific idea that's sort of taught, that's out in the media, that we think about as planners or as cities. Sea level rise, global temperature rise, loss of the ice caps, the drought issues, water supply. They're really fairly specific. And when you look at the planning documents that are done, they address these issues in that way. They don't address it from a broader perspective necessarily. We look at greenhouse gases. What are the impacts of greenhouse gas emissions? But all of these things have secondary impacts. We think about, okay, susceptibility to sea rise. Well, what that really means is a shift in uh, growing seasons. It means a shift in livable land. It means a shift in water resources. And so think about how that impacts population movement. Once we start thinking about it from a broader perspective of it's not just a loss of ice flow, it's a loss of ice flow that leads to X, Y, and Z, and again, starting at double A. And those impacts aren't necessarily in the places we always think they're going to be. I threw in this slide because it focuses on cities. What are some of the risks based upon climate change that are very, very specific to cities themselves? We oftentimes think about, oh, if it's an impact to city, we think about Florida. Oh, well, the sea level rise is going to create some flooded basements. But it's so much more than that. It has a greater impact on tourism, on resources, on just infrastructure generally. How do we move people from one place to another? How do we replace water supplies? Then take that into consideration with the fact that the cities are anticipated to grow to such a great degree that this can really create some planning pitfalls that have to be taken into consideration, that we need to start looking at these numbers and climate migration and where that goes. So, Selin, Selin's, you're the expert on this migration, on refugee. I want to that you
Thank
talk
you.
for a little. Yeah.
Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about how it affects populations and what are the things we need to expect. And if you can change the slide.
Yes.
So what we see is that the last 100 years, like we see the forced migration is not disappearing, it's increasing. And the reasons for that is not only like political conflict, but most of it is related to climate change as well, because the economies are influenced by the climate change, and when the economy is influenced, then it influences the politics and this domino effect. When you look at these pictures, the black and white pictures show the forced migration. The first top picture actually shows the First World War, the forced migration, people being displaced. And on the bottom, you can see from the Second World War, in Europe, the displaced people. And the colored pictures show actually the recent, like the last 2 years. And we can see that in this 100 years, a lot of things have changed. Technology have increased. The cities have, become robust. But there hasn't been much changed with the forced migration and the displacement of people. And this actually gives us a window to what to expect. So in these 100 years, like these displacements have been going on and increasing. Like the last we have seen is just only in Syria, there are 4 million people are displaced outside the country. 12 million people are displaced within the country. So what are we going? It's just like looking at a rear view mirror to determine what is going to happen in front of us. Like we're driving only with a rear view mirror in our approach. And then when we start with this perspective, then like how do we build methodologies? How do we build the future according to that? So if you do change it right now, there are United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees is built after the Second World War to actually handle the displaced people of the Europe. And there were 5 reasons that were established for a person to be considered a refugee, under the UN, which was, like you have to have a well-founded fear of persecution because of the reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership to a social group. So these were deemed as the necessary criteria for to be have a refugee status, basically, under the UN. So this status also gives you certain protections and certain rights, like to be able to work and to be able to live in a place other than your own. So what happens is that it was amended in 1967 because 1951 it was established that there were two limitations. You can change the slide. There were two limitations, and one of the limitations was temporal. They said, like before the events of 1951, and one was geographical. They said, within Europe. In 1967, they removed these clauses, saying, like the temporal and the geographical clause, to make room for the increasing forced migration populations. And some countries, like were the signatories of this, some countries put special clauses to handle. And, I can tell you, Turkey did not, they put a special clause saying that they are keeping the geographical limitation, which means that anybody who is not from Europe was not considered a refugee under the United Nations within the borders of Turkey. So what does this mean is that you can continue the next slide is that the influx of people from Syria, right now close to 4 million people live in Turkey from Syria, which is like the population of almost Denmark and population of Colorado, just the whole population just going into another country within a few years. So and that those people that are in Turkey that are displaced from Syria are not under the UN protection because they are in Turkey. So they are under Turkish protection, and Turkey has their own rules and protections and regulations for these people. So it matters, the nomenclature and the what we consider a refugee, who is considered a refugee matters. So in this, in these clauses, climate migrants and climate refugees are not really considered refugees, protected under the same laws, basically. So an asylum seeker going into a country with a well-founded fear of those 5 things that I mentioned will be immediately, given a certain status and waiting for their asylum case. But if a person is a climate refugee, United Nations does not have the political the recognition to assign a political status to the people who are running away from situations of natural disasters.
Right, and one of the things this does is it actually limits the counts that we have.
And that becomes yes, okay. And that is due to the countries that are receiving them. So there is not a central status that is given, but it depends on the countries that are receiving them. So it makes it a lot harder to subject. I wanted to also mention as an example, like we all think that all the conflict and all the refugee situations in this world always remind us the political implications. But let's take the case of Syria. Syria between 2008 and 2011 had the massive droughts, and farmers lost a lot of crops, and there was hunger. People were hungry, and then this sparked protests to their government. So all the conflict that is happening now, and then and the government coming really violently towards the protesters, and then the protests coming up everywhere, and other countries, getting involved, and there's a power vacuum happening and filling the power vacuum, different groups, the opposition or the rebellious people towards the government, dividing into separate groups and according to different, like religious groups or ethnic groups and things like that. And it became a mess. But before this mess became, the reasons were related to climate change, that's related to the drought, that is related to hunger and economic losses. So this war, as people claim, did not start from ethnic differences or political differences or religious differences. None of these were a factor in the spark of this conflict. It was a simple fact that people were, their livelihoods were endangered. So when we think of it this way, and when we look at all the conflicts in the world, it's that doesn't mean that it is, going to decrease. It means that climate change is not only going to be effective in this political situation, but it could be elsewhere in the world too, because as people are going hungry, can't feed their families, they start to get unrest. So, and then because of the situations, the refugee situation that I told you about, a lot of the migrants decided to, cross Turkey, because to be protected under the United Nations refugee status, they wanted to cross into the countries that were recognizing the 1967 protocol, which is Greece is one of them. So once you land on a Greek island, you are immediately, protected under the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and registered as a refugee. So that's why what was happening was that migrants were just on bigger numbers headed towards Europe to have this status, to be resettled into third countries, to have the rights to work and things like that. So and we also talked about, yes.
Oh, I'm getting ahead of you. I'm sorry. Tell me.
No, it's okay. No, that's good. we need to be cognizant of the time. But so that's a result. That's the end result of this conflict that's happening, is that the influx of people immediately, like hundreds and thousands of people, 1 million people going into a country and influencing the infrastructure there. And so of course, these political situations, when we know about them, then we can equip ourselves to meet the results. But there are certain things, like some of the environmental refugees that won't be able to meet these changes. So what happens is that we cross the word on refugees on this slide because the status is not recognized, worldwide. There isn't a certain status that was given and certain rights and privileges that was given to environmental migrants. And we can see, maybe we don't hear about them as often as we hear the political ones, but we can see that there were many environmental situations causing people to seek refuge. There were volcanic eruptions, like Mount Merapi in Java, Indonesia. And there were about 250,000 people affected because of this. And earthquakes, as we all know, that there's El Salvador, in 2018, again, 250,000 people, Haiti, 60,000 people. And it's continuing since then, several earthquakes that have happened that displaced people, earthquakes in Turkey, earthquakes in Japan. And hurricanes, the hurricanes are coming stronger and stronger every year and more in numbers. And you can see the Hurricane Dorian in Bahamas caused a lot of people to be displaced. And sea level rise is a real issue in some island nations that are really going to be affected. Whole island nations might disappear because of the sea level rise, Maldives, Venice, Netherlands, and also drought, as I mentioned before, water scarcity is a big issue because, without water, human beings can't survive, but also we can't grow things. You can't find food. So Morocco, Syria, in the Middle East, many countries are affected with this enormous drought that is happening right now. So these are some snapshots that I wanted to, like in Turkey in October 2020, in one of the major cities, the second largest city in Turkey was affected by a massive earthquake. And overnight, like your people are homeless and displaced. And this was in Bangladesh, floods causing people to be displaced. I mean, massive loss of human life, also including people being displaced. We can continue. There was this flood in 2006, Adab, and many people were displaced throughout Africa to many of the countries. Again, I told you about the drought in Syria. It's a very serious effect because all of those many places in Syria are agricultural lands, and it is the cradle of civilization is between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, right? Like providing the whole fertile land, and therefore people might congregated in those places because it was fertile, and it is one of the most populated places in the world. And what is happening is the drought is changing the structure of the place, and what's happening is that people no longer can be sustained in that region. So I have been going in the last few years to Turkey, to the Syrian refugee camps, and trying to see the situation, the effect of the migration into the towns. What is it causing? What are some of the problems that it brings with it? And there's many. And number one is basically, as you see, effect on the children, mainly on education. So we will mention it in a little bit later. And so I will give the microphone back to Jennifer, so you can tell us a little bit about what we're seeking.
Sure. So think about it in terms, if we put this in terms where we're used to thinking about, think about some of the early functions of the U.S. Green Building Councils, the idea of LEED certification, the idea of creating communities that have function, accessibility, and economic use of resources. Think about our SEPA and our NEQA analysis, where we're looking at what are the resources that are available, how are they being impacted. We look at population growth in both of those, but we look at it really from as the lawyer representing these in court or representing them for various clients, we don't take a very in-depth look about population. The basic question is it going to cause a population increase? Potentially, check the box, we're done. We don't think about it from the fact that what about the population increase we'll have on the projects or on the cities? On the resources that are already available. We almost need to look at the analysis we currently do on these sorts of things and flip them in reverse. And how do we prepare for that influx? Because the things that we're seeking are the same things that the climate migrants are seeking. They're seeking basically a way to continue their life. I threw in this case because water, if we take this to a very local level to California, water is, especially in Southern California, just a key factor. And it's not just Southern California, it's a worldwide issue. If you don't have clean water, you can't support a population. And you end up with an increase in disease, you end up with an increase of mass infestations. And also we end up with problems with scarcity and losing and decline in populations that we rely upon. The Delta smelt case, for me, it's a really interesting case. I was doing a lot of litigation at this point, environmental litigation, and this case created a huge impact on how we do environmental assessment in California. It was in 2008 that the Department of Fish and Game decided that, which is now Fish and Wildlife in California, decided and that the Delta smelt should be a protected species. And it's a very, I love this picture because it shows it's just a little itty bitty fish, but a little itty bitty fish can have a great big impact on how we do business. This designation triggered a series of lawsuits that lasted for about the next 8 years in California, and trying to figure out how do we really address water, because Southern California doesn't have water and they need to bring water in to support the growing population. We were in the middle of the beginnings of a major drought at that point in time. That just continued to get worse, which is why the litigation increased. It looks like we're now at the beginning stages of a secondary drought. Um, and so we had an issue where we had population coming into California without enough housing. And yet we couldn't build more housing. We couldn't get housing approved. And we certainly couldn't get it through the courts because we couldn't demonstrate that there was water available for the houses as people moved in. If you don't have water, you don't have adequate sanitation. A lot of issues come up with that. And so it became this cyclical aspect where the drought impacts caused by climate change, thrown on top of the fact that we have a potential endangered species that could be threatened by this. We can't bring in water from other sources, and the sources that are currently available are continuing to be diminished. Um, we had a major impact of how this could potentially impact cities in the future. And now we still, even though we somewhat resolved how we're going to analyze water, it still tends to be one of the primary issues in any sort of development that goes forward. We haven't taken into consideration the fact that those water resources are going to continue to be they're going to continue to be challenged, and they'll continue to be challenged simply because we have this population influx. Now, add to that on a broader perspective, the U.S. Drought Monitor updates us regularly. You can go in and you can see live maps of what is the current drought status in the United States, all of the United States. And right now, we're looking at about 40% of the U.S. being in a drought situation. Right now, it's not considered extreme in majority of that. It's about 70% is considered exceptional extreme drought. Most of that, of course, is in California and the West Coast, Southwest areas. But it allows you sort of a mapping tool to show that, this is a continuing issue. In the comments, somebody made a comment that water is really going to be key, and that's absolutely a huge part of this. Is how are we going to provide clean water? And is there enough innovation being projected to be able to address some of these issues? So this is just a visual example. And it's a California example. Oroville Lake, July in 2011, the lake is full, brimming full. Just 3 years later, nearly empty. And this is a picture that could be mirrored all over California. And there's speculation that we're actually in the midst of a 50-year drought. And there's support for that because if you look at, say, Lake Shasta levels, even though we've been officially out of the drought designation for the last couple of years, Lake Shasta levels are nowhere near the levels they were in, say, 1990. So now we have to look at, sorry, I have dogs in the background. We have to look at what are some of the impacts that we need to consider as in the cities themselves. Why is this important to the Green Building Council attendees? Why is this something that we need to really start looking at? Now, keep in mind, as Selin mentioned, there is a difference between refugees and migrants. Refugees are tracked differently. In some ways, it's easier to come up with numbers for them because there's a very specific definition for a refugee if they meet those 5 requirements. Climate change is not currently one of those 5 requirements. I think eventually it probably will be, but at this point in time, it's not. And politics come into play as well here. So the US started bringing in a significant number of refugees. It began with the 1980 Refugee Act, and then in 2002, we started accepting more and more refugees that were specifically defined by that UN 5-category refugee. It reached 100,000 in 2016. This doesn't necessarily include climate migrants, although some of them fall into both categories. Abrupt policy changes in 2017 actually dropped that number by 75%. So we went from 100,000 new immigrants coming in the year before as refugees to 23,000. really significant decline, and that number has actually continued to decline because of COVID and the fact that so many places have closed their borders off. So what does that mean? Well, in some ways, when you think about refugees and immigrants and migration, climate migration, there are automatic negative impacts that we think of. The things that are sort of highlighted in the media is mass influx of population creates strains on housing systems, on education systems, on food and government resources, on the infrastructure itself, sanitation, healthcare, jobs. Racism becomes a highlight because when you have a population that can be identified that by something that it has in common, whether it's ethnicity, religion, you name it, and you then put additional strains on strained resources already, you promote, oh, I don't want to say promote, that's a terrible way to look at it, but it tends to be a push that people who are already feeling dissatisfied bring up much more of the racism aspects of it. You face political challenges and issues of environmental justice. Where do you put people, and how do you make sure that they are knowledgeable in what's happening in the community? Selin, do you want to add anything here?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to add on the educational aspect, right now, when we look at the numbers, about half of the school-age children in the protected refugee status are out of school. So, and the COVID added to this right now, like with the technology and access to resources, there is even a bigger gap in the people. So what's happening is that there's no access to education, and the consequences of that could be really dire, as far as being recruited into conflict situations, being recruited by terrorism, and people who are not getting the economical help to their families because of the lack of education. So it really adds on to it and cascades into each other, into the adding into the problem of how people see each other, how they what they know about each other, causing into discrimination and situations like that. And then of course people keep voting and creating policies and either feeding the divisions or and it could all be prevented when it goes down to if we can set up a system where we are equipped to handle the education of the incoming, if we project it and if we can handle it, the outlook could be quite different.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I thought was fascinating that you had talked to me about before, Selin, is when you were in Turkey and you were with the Syrian refugees, is what you really had witnessed was a lost generation. You have a whole generation of children who are in refugee camps and have been for years and years and years, who have no educational opportunities. And so what happens when they become adults is you really have a lost generation of people who don't have the education that we need in a more modern community. So.
Exactly. And I saw it firsthand. I went to refugee camps, sometimes unofficial refugee camps, where none of the kids were in school. None of the kids had access to education. So they couldn't even learn how to read or write. I mean, that's a huge loss.
So, but there's also a positive reality that goes along with migrant and refugee populations. For example, the city of Buffalo, New York. Buffalo it's a city that's not considered to be a highly cosmopolitan city, but it has a substantial population loss, and it actually has built a system that relies upon an influx of refugees. So without the refugee and migrants that come into the city, that are actually anticipated and Buffalo tries to attract, they don't have enough workers. And it's not just in Buffalo. Salt Lake City is another example where they actually have a very strong reliance upon an increased labor force coming in. And without that, they have such a low unemployment rate that they actually can't find workers who can come in and support the job structure that they need. These are just two examples. I know Idaho
I
is
just
another one.
Yeah, I just want to add to it Iowa as well.
Or Iowa, sorry.
More in Iowa, there's a huge number of like refugee settlement. It's a refugee resettlement state because Iowa population is decreasing. Young Iowans coming to a certain age are going out of the state. It's an agricultural state and provides much of our food basically, and they need workers. So they get an influx of refugees and migrants in order to fill this gap.
Right. I see a question asking how COVID's impacted this. It's actually had an even stronger impact because first we have the policies that limit the number of refugee and migrants that are coming into the country. And then with COVID, that's even stronger limitations on who can travel and who can come in. And so, and then we have also additional, increases and pressure on the healthcare system that go along with that. I know we've seen in the news a lot lately, fast food restaurants can't find workers and they're blaming it on COVID. They're blaming it on the checks that the government's sending out and the $300 a week increase as a reason why people don't want to go back to work. But a huge part of it is we've cut off our labor supply. Because a lot of these cities, they built a model around this. Now, there's cities that have not built a model around this, absolutely. But when you have a model that's built around bringing in new workers on a regular basis, whether from simple internal migration or whether it's refugees or whether it's external, out of country migration, then it causes a problem in those communities. And just a little bit of fact is refugees bring a lot to the community. In 2015, it was estimated that they actually are bringing about $56 billion in spending power to the U.S. 13% of refugees are entrepreneurs. And part of that is because they may be coming in with strong education from the countries they're coming from, whether they're doctors, lawyers, other kinds of professionals in those countries. They don't have the degrees in the US. They don't have the certifications in the US. A lawyer can't come from Zambia and practice law in the United States without passing the bar in a state. I can't even move to another state and practice law without taking the bar in that state. So what happens when we have people that come in, they don't have a strong language background, but they have the skills in the background. They become entrepreneurs. So you want to add to that?
That's it. I saw that too. There was an EBRD study for refugee women in Turkey and a Syrian woman. Usually, the women's inclusion into the economy was a lot slower than the rest of the population, and they looked into that, and the employment rate was really low. But then, when they looked at the entrepreneurship, there was a really high entrepreneurship level among the refugees. Number one, they're risk takers. They've already moved into a different country, but more than that, the flexibility it brings into especially a woman's lives, and it was taken into consideration. So it is, and they have contributed to the economy substantially through their entrepreneurship.
So I'm looking at the time, and we're okay. I'm going to start going a little faster because we're running out of time. But quick things to highlight is these are the top 10 states for refugee resettlement that's tracked. And you can follow this pattern. These are going to be the same states that the climate migrant trajectory hits, and primarily because they have a lot in common. California is number one. In fact, 1 in 9 refugees come to California. And so, but if you notice, of these 10 states, nearly all of them have climate challenges. And they also tend to be the states that currently are looking at creating or have already started creating within their cities or at their state levels climate action plans. And so I think the goal is now to make sure those climate action plans actually take into account the major challenges that come in with an influx of refugees with regard to housing, sanitation, food, water, energy shortages, because any housing you build, anything that you need in order to support, an increase in population takes energy. So what's being done? We wanted to sort of look at what are some of the current plans that are being done. I threw this in Germany was one of the first states that really opened their door, not one of the first, not the only one, but one of the first that really just sort of opened their doors and said, "Come, we'll get it all sorted out once you're here." And within a couple of weeks, 100,000 migrants, climate migrants, entered into Germany. In 2015, they ended up having to close their borders again because they ended up with almost a million additional members of their population because of climate migration, because of this need for a place. The problem was they didn't really have a plan in place, and it was the idea of we'll just do this and take it as it comes. Well, now looking back in 2020, half of those who came in still don't have access to paid employment, which means that they're also, having struggles in other areas with regard to healthcare, with regard to finding housing that's adequate, with regard to educational system. It's created a strong political divide in the country, and it's also they've seen a pretty strong increase in racism and hate crimes. And so they are slowly adjusting. They are making it work, but this is what happens when you don't have a plan in place.
And
Um,
I want to quickly add to that. Then Europe has Europe has economies that are developed, the infrastructures that are highly efficient, and still they were having these kinds of problems. And whereas like border states like Turkey took in 4 million refugees, which is an enormous number. And if you look at like Rohingya refugees going into Bangladesh, and these economies that are not, like nearly as strong as US or European economies, are having this burden of providing for this population increase, immediate population increase, and which turns into social, economic, cultural, spatial changes all of a sudden, and needs to be planned. And there is a town I just mentioned here that has more refugees. Population of refugees are more than the population of the town.
yeah. So a couple of cities have gone ahead and come up with plans to help promote this. Buffalo is, I think, one of the most interesting examples because they've actually decided to identify themselves as a climate refuge. And one of the reasons for that is they've had, because of the influence of the Great Lakes and how much influence that has on the weather for the area, while they've seen some temperature increase, overall it's stayed relatively stable. And so from a climate aspect, it's a stable population. They want to bring in more population because they're losing people. Whereas they're trying to promote industry, they're trying to change some of their outlook. And so they've created a lot of programs that not only bring people in, but help support the infrastructure, that help support the educational aspects, that help them set up new businesses. And at the same time, they're using that influx of people to create what they call a climate smart community. Essentially, they're upgrading all of their facilities. They're putting in solar. They're putting in ways where they can lower their climate footprint at the same time providing for the migrant populations that are resulting from climate change. They probably have one of the more advanced plans, but they also have unique situations in that they're losing population and they need people. And so that's one aspect. Barcelona looked at a refugee city plan as well. And they started doing this in 2015. It's been an ongoing measure. What they really looked at, though, initially was just focus on immediate shelter and immediate needs. This idea of kinetic cities. If we look at it in Palm Springs when we have music festival, they look at it in India when all of a sudden, several 100,000 people come for religious celebrations. It's the idea that you can create a supported sanitary city that's temporary. And so part of their city plan and their design is not to necessarily host long-term climate immigrants, but to create a stopping point and to create a kinetic city, and then coordinate with other cities within the EU in order to sort of create more long-term planning. Mukuru, Nairobi, looked at it from a little different perspective. They looked at how do we support the climate migrants that are coming in, and specifically looked at ways to deal with waste management, cooler housing because of the climate. How do they create more green spaces, provide solar energy, and ways to actually, develop the city in a meaningful way, because this is an area that is not already developed. That they, while there certainly are modern conveniences there, it's not to the level that we see in cities in the United States. And so they have sort of a unique opportunity to use this population to actually create more sustainable city from the start. Um, Florida is a stopping point not only for migrants coming into the US, but for we look at things like Hurricane Katrina, and they are regular use to displaced residents. And so they created something called the resilience force, where they're actually looking to utilize this migrant workforce in the rebuilding efforts. And so they're creating programs and incentives to bring in migrants to help with those rebuilding efforts. So just different ways cities are looking at things. Selene, I'm going to let you talk a little bit about Globally Connected, because that's
Just,
rest,
just
rest,
very briefly,
yeah,
our nonprofit organization fills a gap because there is no official organizations that are helping refugees in this area, because there is not a population identified in this area. But we do have educational. We provide education, transportation, and some basic needs for the refugee populations here, and basically community building, because you can. It doesn't matter, like if you don't build communities, building a house does not matter so much. So it's a very important issue to build communities, have well-functioning communities within each other, so that we can look at the future in a more optimistic way.
right. So what do we need? What do we need to order to really look at sustainability planning while incorporating this? It's not just a potential population increase; it's a population migration that is going to happen. And in fact, one of the most interesting things I think I read is when we look at statistics and potential for climate impacts based upon temperature, we think about, okay, with a 2-degree temperature increase, we're going to have X number of additional forest fires, or increase in drought at percentage, and it depends on how much the temperature increase makes a difference on how much more of a fire danger we're going to have. Well, the same thing is true for migrant populations from climate change, and it makes perfect sense. If there's an increased pressure on resources, there's going to be an increased need for people to move. And so we have to think about, what do we need to know in order to really do adequate planning? There are efforts being made at data tracking. Big data is increasingly important in figuring out and as a planning tool. So what did we do? First, we have to think about is tracking movements. Some tracking will come from immediate issues, such as hurricanes, where you have a population that is suddenly forced to move. But we also have long-term impacts. So we have to know what the demographics are. We have to know who's potentially moving and where they might be potentially moving to. We have to look at, what are the thresholds? So how long is somebody willing to stay in a place before they're forced to move? In some situations, that could be a longer period of time than others. Southern California is essentially going into a drought, but we're well set up to be able to withstand thresholds for quite a long time before people will be forced to move from California, whereas other places don't have quite that ability to hold on, if you will. The resources simply will not be there. So we have to think about, what are the thresholds? What's the likelihood that people are going to move, and when are they going to move? We have to do a comparison of what climate data is out there. We have to look at the educational levels of population, because it's not only a matter of when will people be forced to move, but when they move and where they're moving to, what are the requirements for them to be able to integrate into that community and have it be a positive thing rather than a negative impact. With proper planning, that is possible, but we have to look at it again as the cities are building out. What's the potential for population migration to end up in those cities? If in Southern California, if the numbers are correctly, it's a pretty high number. 1 in 12, 1 in 10 of the people that are coming in will end up in California cities. And so we need to think about, okay, what's the infrastructure that's needed? What's the sanitation requirements that are needed? And then look at it from an environmental justice standpoint as well. What is necessary in order to bring things in? So it looks like our sessions are now closed.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you.
all right.